Hi, Joydeep. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Ishan. Thank you.
We just discussed the express loan system in one of our segments. There has been a flurry of digital products in the market, and earlier this year, there was an announcement for setting up 75 digital banking units or DBUs as well. Is this the pivotal year when we see most banks transition to a digital first strategy? Also, should RBI enforce guidelines for a minimum number of DBUs each year like it did for bank branches?
No, thank you for the question, Ishan. I would say, though, that the acceleration in digital started during the COVID years. And I mean, I'm not suggesting that we're out of it, but we are certainly, I think in the last 2 years, we've seen dramatic acceleration. When we look at, however, this proposal to create these DBUs, I think they could certainly act as a catalyst. Right now, a lot needs to be done by existing commercial banks to think about what's the right model. In my mind, I think there are two approaches. I think there is one way to really think about taking these 75 DBUs and enabling adoption in the rural areas, in the semi-urban areas, through partnerships with distribution partners like BCs, post offices, etc., and really using that as a way to accelerate digital adoption. So really adoption being the primary focus. The other is to use it as a common authentication layer, right? Which, like a UPI, for example, through which individual banks can essentially offer their digital services, whether it's on the account opening side or whether low ticket lending, etc. Now, there is one option which I think is very interesting, which is to say that, look, is there an opportunity for the central bank governor to truly create a fully fledged digital bank only with its 75 digital branches run centrally using modern technological architecture and stack and so on? I don't think that's conceived at the moment, but I'd imagine that's an option which certainly exists as well. In terms of mandating, I'm not that a big fan of mandating branches, but I think most people will adopt this gladly.
One of the drawbacks of some of the public sector banks, as I understand, is the slow adoption of digital. What do you think the government needs to do there to bring them on a par with the private sector?
I think it's worth stepping back and looking at what has happened to the market as a whole. And if I look, as McKinsey, we conduct a personal financial service survey every year. So between 2017 and 2021, what we've seen, if you call digital first customers, have gone up from less than 13% to over 30%. Multi-channel users have gone up from 60 to 73%. So if you look at some of these trends, and old-fashioned branch lovers have gone down from 15% to about 9%. Now, in that context, I think if you look at who has driven this change, and you look at public sector versus private sector, I'll take one example. If you look at an SBI, SBI's numbers are actually better than the market average in terms of digital acceleration. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's useful to classify the public sector, private sector debate. On the other hand, I think there are a large number of public sector banks which aren't quite there. I think there are two issues which need to be addressed. I think the first is talent, right? Technical talent. You do need, I think, a very different cadre. And, it's not public sector banks per se are not attractive employment destination for the best technological talent that exists. So I think that issue needs to be addressed. The other is enabling faster partnerships, etc., with other tech companies so that they can rapidly overhaul their whole technology platforms. So I would say both talent as well as partnerships would be two areas which could be enabled for public sector banks to even move faster. One thing I will say that their physical network is actually a big advantage to digital adoption. So they could, if enabled, can actually do much better than the private sector banks.
Now, when we are talking about debates, one of the debates that comes about is the neobanks versus the traditional banks. Now, the payment bank system did not quite work well in India. What do you think were its failings? And is there any way to salvage that position now?
It's a great question. And, sometimes hindsight is always gives us lots of learnings. So if you recall, the payment bank approach was first envisaged in the early part of this decade, right? And only 2016, many of them came into being. Mm-hmm. And then since then, I think they were quite restricted in terms of what they could do. The active balance that you could have in deposits, payments at wafer-thin margins, and virtually no lending. And then you had UPI and other digital infrastructure come in, which I would say was not envisaged at that point in time. So that knocked the winds out of their sails at this point. Second, I think the existing banks really ramped up their own digital plays. So in a way, for a customer point of view, it wasn't obvious what the value proposition of the payment banks are. And in fact, I would argue that in today's construct, it's quite an unviable business proposition. At the same time, though, there are about 4 payment banks which intermediate a ton of payments, right, in the country.
Yes.
Maybe enabling them to do microcredit, broadening the scope of work that they could do, could allow, I think, for these to be equally successful over time.
Now, talking about failures, foreign banks haven't performed too well either. We just saw the Citi deal. Why do you think that is? And did they lose out on technology, or was it a losing out on culture part?
I would say that it's important when we talk of foreign banks to separate the businesses. So if you look at retail versus wholesale, right? And I would argue that in the wholesale banking space, foreign banks are doing exceedingly well in India. We come back to the retail space. I think if you look at criteria for success historically, it's been distribution presence.
Yes.
And foreign banks have been massively hampered because of regulatory restrictions on where they could expand and so on. And that gave the private sector banks and, of course, the public sector banks tremendous runway in terms of customer acquisitions. So it was very hard actually to come back from that position in terms of creating a truly profitable at scale retail franchise. I would say that is a primary reason. I think there is a secondary reason, which is around the structure of decision making on things like technology, etc. Typically, global banks tend to have one platform for all good reasons across the world. Local banks can be much more adaptive and create bespoke technology solutions for the Indian market. And I think that's the secondary reason I would also argue. Despite having, I would underscore, really terrific talent, I think the foreign banks have really struggled on the consumer side.
Now, linking back to the first question again, because we've been doing some linkages there, a large part of the population has been covered under the Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Jam Trinity, and other benefits have also flowed too. But most of these have been account operations. Most of the accounts have been open. What do you think the government needs to do to bring more retail products to these people?
No, thank you again. And again, I'll do the interlinkages with your question in a second, right? So there are a number of these schemes which are on way insofar as meeting on the asset side need, right, of the massive concern. I think what we need, though, still to really accelerate and make this happen are 3 things. I think one, we need real partnerships with distribution on the ground. So, we talked about the post offices, we talked about the front end PCs, but that really needs to kick in. 2, that needs to get digitized, because that's going to, and the adoption of that. So if you recall, which is where I draw the linkage to the DBB, the first model of linkage could enable this certainly. And third is, frankly, the financing of this has to be ultimately viable, right, over a period of time. So collections, etc., need to be put in place. So those are some of the enablers, but I think it's been a very good set of moves already, which have been made a good starting point, I would say.
That's about it. Thank you. Thanks a lot for coming on the show. It was great talking to you, and we hope to have you back again soon.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Same here. Thank you.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.